The weaver of the tablet. In the winter of 1927, in the ruins of Ur, a city in what is now southern Iraq, Leonard Woolley's workmen lifted a broken disk of pale stone out of a room in the Jipparu, the walled residence where the high priestess of the moon god had lived. It was limestone, about 10 inches across and 3 thick, carved on one face and inscribed on the other, and it came up in pieces. Woolley's excavations at Ur produced golden helmets and lyres with bulls' heads and a royal cemetery full of attendants who had gone down into the burial pits alongside their masters. And against that competition, a shattered stone plaque did not command much attention. It was numbered, packed, shipped, and eventually accessioned by a museum in Philadelphia, where it still is. Carved on one face is a procession. A naked priest pours a libation onto an altar. Behind him stands a woman in a flounced garment and a rolled cap, taller than everyone else in the scene, which in the art of Sumer, the civilization of these cities, is not a comment on her height. Her arm is bent, and her hand is raised before her face in the standard gesture for greeting a god. Behind her follow 2 attendants. Much of the surface is worn nearly smooth, and what is on display is a restoration. A 20th century reconstruction of a smashed object that added at least one figure and turned a damaged section into something that reads as a stepped tower. That identification has since been challenged. The shape is more likely the statue of a deity. On the back is an inscription, and it gives a name. It says in Sumerian that Enheduana, priestess of Nana, spouse of Nana, daughter of Sargon the king of the world, built an altar in the temple of the goddess Inanna at Ur, and named that altar Table of Heaven. That is the whole text. It is a building inscription, the most ordinary genre in Mesopotamia, the kind of thing that survives by the thousand, and it would be of no particular interest except that 500 years later Babylonian scribes would attribute a body of poetry to the woman it names. On the strength of those poems, she is now routinely described as the first author in human history, whose name is known. That claim is about 60 years old in its modern form, and it has been argued over ever since, in journals and conference volumes, and in one very short note that did more damage than anything else written on the subject. Start with what is not in dispute. Sargon of Akkad conquered the Sumerian cities in the 24th century before the Common Era and built the first empire the region had seen, a state that ran from the Persian Gulf up into what is now northern Syria, held together by garrisons, by a redistributive economy, and by the placement of Akkadian-speaking officials in Sumerian-speaking cities. Ur was among the greatest of those cities, and the moon god Nana was its patron. At the head of the moon god's temple stood a human priestess called the En, who was understood to be the god's wife. She lived in the Jipparu, a complex of courtyards and storerooms and a shrine, and she administered a substantial estate. None of this was decorative. She controlled land, grain, and labor, and the accounts to prove it survive. Sargon installed his daughter in the office, which is politics of a kind that needs no explanation. Put your child at the top of the religious establishment of the city you have just taken, and the establishment becomes yours. It is worth saying, though, that he did not invent the position or the gesture. The art historian Irene Winter showed that the office of En priestess and its whole iconography, the flounced robe, the cap, the disc-shaped votive plaque, run back centuries before Sargon. He was not creating a role for his daughter. He was stepping into one that already carried authority, which is generally the cheaper way to acquire authority. What is more surprising is how long the arrangement held. Royal daughters continued to be installed at Ur for centuries after Sargon's dynasty collapsed. His grandson Naram-Sin put in his own daughter. So did kings of Isin, and later the kings of Larsa, rival cities upriver, whose sisters and daughters held the post 400 years after Enheduana and left inscriptions about rebuilding the priestess's residence. Appointing a princess to Ur became standing royal practice, one of those institutions that starts as a move and ends as something everyone assumes has always existed. Somewhere in there, and the exact century is the whole question, the priestess acquired a second reputation. Compositions in Sumerian came to be associated with her name. The most famous is a long hymn to Inanna known in English as the Exaltation of Inanna. There is a second long hymn to the same goddess. There is a collection of 42 short hymns, one to each of the great temples of the land, functioning as a kind of sacred directory. And there are 2 fragmentary hymns to the moon god. Modern scholars have added a 6th, a narrative poem in which Inanna levels a mountain that refused to bow to her, though the ancient tradition never linked that one to her at all. The exaltation is the one that carries the claim, because it is the one with a person in it. It opens by addressing the goddess directly as the queen of all the me. That word, a Sumerian noun pronounced roughly like the English word may, has no clean equivalent. It covers something like the whole set of powers, offices, crafts, and conditions that make civilization work, from kingship and priesthood down to carpentry, and including such items as strife, deceit, and grief. To call Inanna the queen of all of them is to say that everything organized runs through her. The poem then describes her as a storm, as a flood, as fire falling on the land, as a creature at whose battle cry the mountains bend. This goes on for many lines, at a level of violence that has surprised readers who arrived expecting a goddess of love, which she also is. Then, 60 lines in, the poem changes register completely, and a voice says, "I am the high priestess, I am Enheduana." What follows is an account of catastrophe in the first person. A man named Lugalain has seized power. He has stripped the temple. She has been driven out of the priestess's residence, out of her office, out of the city, made to fly, she says, like a swallow from a window. Her priestly regalia has been taken from her, and a dagger put in her hand instead. Funeral offerings have been made for her, as though she had never lived there, which is a way of saying that as far as the city is concerned, she is already dead. She appeals to Nana, the moon god, her divine husband and her patron, and Nana does not answer. This is a poem about a woman abandoned by the god she is married to, addressed to a different god entirely, and that is not a small thing to have written down and let other people read. And along with everything else, she has lost her eloquence. Her honeyed mouth, the poem says, has turned bitter. The words that were her whole professional function will not come. Then comes the strangest passage, which is the reason the authorship question matters. Having lost her voice, she gets it back by composing. The poem describes its own making, at night, alone in exile. According to the speaker, what was inside her had grown too full to hold, and she brought it forth for the goddess. And one line of manuscript tradition uses a verb that means to give birth. What she sang in the dead of night, she asks a professional lamenter to repeat at midday, which is a very practical instruction to find in the middle of a mystical passage, and which tells you that she expected the thing to be performed. The last dozen lines then shift into the third person to report the outcome. The goddess accepted the offering. Her heart was cooled, the priestess was restored. So the text presents itself as a self-portrait. A named woman in a documented office in a specific political crisis, describing the composition of the very poem in which she is describing it. Almost nothing else in 3,000 years of cuneiform literature does that. Mesopotamian literature is overwhelmingly anonymous. Scribes signed tablets as copyists in a note at the end called a colophon, and that note says who wrote out the clay, not who made the poem. The gods gave you the words. That singularity is what produced the modern claim. William Hallow and Johannes van Dyck published the standard edition of the Exaltation at Yale in 1968 and framed it as the work of a historical poet. The Danish Assyriologist Oj Westenhals wrote in 1999 that she was, In fact, the first real author in the modern sense of that word, known to world history. Betty de Chong-Meador, a Jungian analyst, produced literary translations in 2000 and 2009 that reached far beyond the specialist journals and put Enheduana onto poetry syllabuses. Since then, there has been a crater named after her on Mercury, a major exhibition at the Morgan Library in New York in the autumn of 2022 called She Who Wrote, and a complete translation by Sophus Hell, published by Yale in 2023 with the subtitle The Complete Poems of the World's First Author. Underneath all of that sits a problem that has been known for as long as the claim has existed, and that nobody in the field disguises. There is no manuscript of any poem attributed to Enheduana from her own lifetime, or from anywhere near it. Every substantially preserved copy is Old Babylonian, roughly the 18th century before the Common Era, 500 years after Sargon. 2 tablets survive from the intervening period, both from the 3rd dynasty of Ur, about 2 centuries earlier than the Old Babylonian copies, and neither settles anything. One is a fragmentary hymn to the moon god that mentions Enheduana in the 3rd person rather than speaking in her voice, and has her doing something, carrying prayers down to the freshwater abyss, that does not match the picture the other poems give. The other is a manuscript of the temple hymns, which shows that the collection existed by then. Its final lines, the ones that carry the attribution, are broken away. So the 3rd millennium evidence for the literary Enheduana amounts to a building inscription that says nothing about poetry, and 2 damaged tablets, one of which mentions her, and one of which might have. What survives instead is the Old Babylonian school system. There is a great deal of it. Excavations at Nippur, another major city about 100 miles up the Euphrates from Ur and the religious and scholarly center of the country, began turning up private houses in the 1890, whose floors and benches and walls had been made partly out of old exercise tablets. Clay is clay, and a used tablet is a brick. One of these buildings, dug by a joint Chicago and Philadelphia expedition in the early 1950s and known in the literature simply as House F, produced just over 1,400 tablet fragments from a handful of small rooms. Elena Robson published the reconstruction of that house and its contents in 2001, and it remains the clearest view anyone has of how a Sumerian scribe was actually made. The tablets show a curriculum. Students began with sign lists and name lists, moved to proverbs and model contracts, and then worked through a fixed sequence of 10 longer literary compositions that modern scholars call the Decad, copied and recopied by every student who got that far. Roughly 20 copies of each turned up in that one house. The 4th item in the Decad is the Exaltation of Inanna. Of the 96 known manuscripts of that poem at the time Robson wrote, 36 came from House F alone. 36 copies from one house of one poem. It survives, in other words, for much the same reason the multiplication table survives. Because children were made to write it out, over and over, in a building whose rubbish became its walls. The Enheduana corpus is therefore not a literary survival in the ordinary sense. It is a teaching survival, and what a teaching survival preserves is not necessarily what somebody wrote 500 years earlier. Paul Del Nero has spent much of his career on this problem. Comparing all the duplicate copies of the Decad line by line, he found that on average 90 to 95% of the content of any given line is identical in every copy, down to the spelling, which is a remarkably high figure for hand transmission. But the variation that does occur is not the kind produced by copying with a model tablet on the desk. It is the kind produced by memory. Words arrive early, pulled forward from further on in the passage. Lines get written twice. Phrases wander in from other compositions the student also knew by heart. Del Nero's conclusion, published in 2012, is that nearly all surviving copies of Sumerian literature were written out from memory. Take that seriously, and the idea of the text softens. These compositions were relatively fixed, but not standardized. They lived in the heads of a small number of people who had learned them in adolescence, and they came back out onto clay a little differently each time. There is a second habit on top of that one, and it is better documented. Old Babylonian scribes revised. They updated obsolete expressions, changed archaic spellings, and corrected what looked to them like errors and were in fact the remains of an older stage of the language. They did it because they had to understand what they were memorizing. Sumerian by their day had been dead as a spoken language for centuries, studied by people who went home and spoke Akkadian. So the received text of the exaltation is a memorized text, groomed for intelligibility, written down by teenagers, 500 years after the events it describes. The linguistic argument against her authorship is usually credited to Miguel Civil, in a paper delivered at a conference in Paris and published in 1980, and it is worth being precise about what he actually said, because it is less than it is usually made to carry. He was discussing one poem, the second hymn to Inanna. He gave no philological evidence at all. What he wrote was that examining its language and vocabulary made him suspect the text dated from the later Larsa period. A suspicion, in one sentence, about one composition. That sentence has been cited in nearly every discussion of Enheduana's authorship for 45 years, and Gonzalo Rubio, summarizing the position in 2009, put the conclusion flatly. She began to be regarded as an author only in a tradition that starts centuries after her death, which makes this a case of traditional authorship rather than historical. The comparison that gives the skeptical case its force is with a body of texts nobody defends. Old Babylonian schools also studied a collection of letters, supposedly exchanged between the kings of the third dynasty of and their generals and governors during the collapse of that empire. They read like authentic third millennium documents, full of specific military detail, written in the first person by named historical people. Piotr Michalowski's edition showed that their transmission says otherwise. They are a retrospective literary reconstruction of the fall of a dynasty, composed or heavily reworked in the schools long afterward and studied as models of style. If the schools could manufacture a correspondence, they could manufacture a poet. And the same tradition names a chief leatherworker as the author of a chronicle that is a demonstrable scribble fabrication, so nobody thinks a leatherworker wrote it. In 2001, Wilfrid Lambert added a further possibility in a 2-paragraph note that Hell, among others, has argued against directly since. Virtually all royal inscriptions from Mesopotamia are written in the first person, and virtually nobody believes the kings wrote them. A highly literary prayer in the name of an Assyrian king, composed in a Sumerian and Babylonian that the king could not possibly have commanded, was obviously supplied by a scribe. Against that background, Lambert suggested, the distinctive style of Enheduana's claimed compositions could be that of a courtier as easily as of the lady herself. Flattering a king's daughter, he noted, could be a step to high office and all its trappings. He ended with a sentence aimed at the whole field. Our emotional response to ancient texts is not necessarily the best criterion of judgment. In 2002, Jeremy Black went back to the manuscripts of the temple hymns and counted lines. The temple hymns are the collection of 42 short hymns to the temples of Sumer and Akkad, edited in 1969 by Ake Esjerberg, and a collaborator from the manuscripts then known. Esjerberg wrote on the opening page of that edition that the subscript of the text informs us that the collection was made by Enheduana, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who dedicated it to her father. That sentence was quoted for the next 30 years, inside the field and outside it, and, as Black observed, seemed never to be questioned. Structurally, the collection is rigid, Each hymn addresses one temple, runs a dozen or two lines, and ends with a refrain saying that the god has erected a house in your precinct and taken a seat upon your dais. After the refrain comes one administrative line, giving the number of lines in the hymn and the name of the shrine. 15 lines, the house of such and such a god in such and such a city. That counting line is the last line of the hymn. It happens 42 times. Think of it as a page number printed at the foot of the page. It is not part of the poem, it marks where the poem stops. The final hymn, number 42, is addressed to the temple of Nisaba, the goddess of writing and accounting, at a place called Eresh. 4 manuscripts from Nippur preserve the end of it. In 3 of them, including the one manuscript that preserves the whole collection from beginning to end, the 2 lines naming Enheduana come before the counting line. Inside the page number, so to speak. Part of hymn 42 and of nothing else. In one manuscript they come after. That single tablet is the entire basis for reading those lines as a signature, covering all 42 hymns, rather than as the closing couplet of the last one. And the divergent tablet has a peculiarity that explains itself. Its counting line reads 13, and there are 13 lines written above it, after which the 2 Enheduana lines are squeezed in at the bottom. 13 counted, 13 written. Then 2 more underneath. Black's reconstruction is that the scribe wrote out the hymn, dropped 2 lines without noticing, tallied what was on the tablet, wrote 13, then saw the omission and put the missing lines in below the count, where there was room. His conclusion was carefully limited. At most, he wrote, it might be reasonable to accept a claim for Enheduana's authorship or editorship of the hymn addressed to the temple of Nisaba at Eresh. Whether that claim itself goes back to the Akkadian period is a quite separate question. The commonplace that made the whole collection hers rests on a scribe who lost count. The lines themselves are hard, which is part of why the misreading survived. In Sumerian, the first of them applies to Enheduana, a compound noun built on a verb whose Akkadian equivalents mean to bind, to tie, to knot together, to organize. Esierberg rendered it compiler of the tablet. Others have said the one who put the tablet together. Hell, in his 2023 translation, chose the weaver of the tablet, on the argument that ancient authorship was conceived as the binding of existing threads into a new fabric, which is the same metaphor that gives European languages the word text, from the Latin for something woven. The second line is easier and stranger. My king, it says, something has been born that had not been born before. A claim of originality, in a collection where originality is not the whole story. The temple hymns contain a hymn to a temple built for the deified king Shulgi at roughly 2 centuries after Enheduana. That hymn, number 9, carries one extra word in its counting line. Addition, it says. 15 lines, addition, Shulgi's house in The tradition flags it as an insertion, which can be read either way and has been. It can mean the collection was old and revered enough by Shulgi's day that a king wanted into it. It can equally mean the collection grew. And it grew in places that are not flagged. Hymn 12 celebrates a temple of the moon god at Gish and mentions the priestess's residence there. Amur-Sin, a king of the same later dynasty, left an inscription claiming that he built that residence, and stating explicitly that from ancient times no such building had stood there, and no priestess had ever lived in it. Both statements cannot be true. Royal inscriptions lie about construction as a matter of routine, so the king's word is not automatically better than the poem's, but the poem now has to be defended rather than simply read. At the other end of the collection, the form itself turns out to predate her. Excavations at a site called Abu Salabik recovered a set of short hymns of praise, each addressed to a deity and closing with a formula, from around 2500 before the Common Era, 2 centuries before Sargon. Some of the temple hymns have precise parallels there. Hel, who defends her authorship, states the difficulty without softening it. With some of the hymns older than Enheduana and some added after her, it becomes unclear in what sense the collection is hers, and unclear how the text can claim to have made something that never existed before, when what it was doing was reusing verses and forms that already did. Benjamin Foster's counterargument is that linguistic dating of a memorized, revised, school-transmitted text cannot bear the weight the skeptics put on it. If scribes updated obsolete expressions as a matter of course, and they demonstrably did, then finding later language in the received text tells you when the text was last groomed, not when it was made. The anachronisms are real. What they prove is another matter, and Foster thinks they prove very little. There is a control case. A composition called the Kesh Temple Hymn, which is a completely separate work, unrelated to Enheduana's collection despite the confusing similarity of the name, was known for a long time only from old Babylonian school copies. Then manuscripts of that same Kesh hymn turned up at Abu Salabik, 700 years older. The early copies contain substantially the same text as the late ones, allowing for adjustments of grammar and style. It is therefore demonstrable, from a case where both ends of the chain happen to survive, that a Sumerian literary composition could pass through 7 centuries of copying and remain recognizably itself. Foster's second point is blunter, and he made it to a magazine rather than a journal. There is a tendency in the field, he said, to regard it as a sign of wisdom not to take ancient texts at their word. Why would the scribes look back and find a high priestess and say she wrote the texts? Whatever else is true, there is more evidence for Enheduana than for any other author in ancient Mesopotamia, which is a low bar and is also the point, since she is the only one there is. There is an internal argument about quality that cannot be formalized and is hard to dismiss. The Mesopotamian tradition produced a great deal of court poetry written in the names of kings, and it reads like court poetry, adulatory and formulaic. The exaltation is not that. It is a poem in which the speaker accuses her own god of ignoring her, describes her professional humiliation in unflattering detail, and stakes everything on a goddess portrayed throughout as terrifying and not especially kind. Hell's answer to the ghostwriter suggestion is essentially that a courtier angling for promotion does not write this. Del Nero's counter is one sentence. She speaks in the first person. That is not the same as being the author. Every position here has a real argument behind it. The most recent full-length treatment, a scholarly biography that appeared in 2025, describes her as the alleged author. Elena Robson, the archaeologist who reconstructed House F, has called the modern Enheduana a wish-fulfilment figure. One survey article on the question ends its title with a question mark. Meanwhile, Hell's Yale translation, the Morgan exhibition, and the crater on Mercury are all in place. And the popular version of the claim has hardened into something that no longer knows it is contested. Sophis Hell's other contribution, made first in an article in 2019, was to stop asking whether the attribution is true and start asking what it was for. Attribution is not free. Somebody has to want it, and the question is who. His answer puts the work at Nippur, in the decades after 1740 BCE. Those were bad years. The southern cities had revolted and been abandoned. The scribal establishment that had trained generations of administrators was losing its institutional footing, and Sumerian, already long dead as a spoken language, was in danger of becoming merely obscure. Scholars in that position have to show that the tradition they hold is worth funding. A heap of anonymous compositions is hard to make a claim on. A tradition with an author, a person with a name and a story, becomes a thing that can be possessed, taught, and transmitted by people who can prove they have access to it. On that reading, Enheduana's authorship is a piece of institutional infrastructure. She gave a scattered corpus a body and a face at the moment it most needed one. Gina Konstantopoulos has drawn out the corollary. Whether the historical woman wrote these poems may be beside the point. What is demonstrable is that her authorship mattered enormously to the scribes who copied them, and the image of a single voice behind many stories is itself a historical fact, and a larger one than the question of who held the stylus. It is a satisfying reframe, and it is not a full answer, because it does not tell you whether she wrote them. Nothing does. Evidence that would settle it would be a tablet from her own century, with her poems on it. No such tablet has been found, and there is not much reason to expect one, since almost nothing literary survives from the old Akkadian period at all. The disc is worth coming back to. Around the 20th century, before the Common Era, 350 years or so after Enheduana, a princess of Isin named Enanatuma held the same office in the same building and undertook a rebuilding of the Jiparu. She is a different woman from the Larsa princesses mentioned earlier, and she comes about 200 years before the Nippur schoolrooms. In the course of that rebuilding, the smashed disc of her distant predecessor appears to have come to light, already broken and already old enough to be an antique. Scribes copied the inscription onto a fresh tablet, and that copy is where the text is best preserved today. The stone itself was probably reburied in the new foundations. 2 centuries later, in a small house at Nippur, students were writing out the exaltation of Inanna from memory, 20 and 30 copies of it, on tablets that ended up recycled into the walls of the room they were written in. Both are acts of preservation. Both are also acts of reconstruction, and there is no clean way to separate the two. The disc on display in Philadelphia is a modern restoration of an object that was already, in antiquity, being restored by being copied. What is read today as the exaltation is a memorized text, groomed by its transmitters, reassembled by modern editors out of 100-odd partial copies made by children. And what the poem describes, in its central passage, is that same operation. A woman who has lost her voice sits alone at night and brings something into being that was not there before, a made thing, offered to a goddess, in the hope that it will be accepted and that she will be restored. The word applied to her in the closing lines of the other collection is a word for tying things together. Which is what the scribes did. They took what they had: hymns of various ages, a name from a building inscription, an office with real institutional weight, and a story about exile and restoration. They bound them together into a single thing and put a name on it, and the name has now traveled 4,000 years and been given to a crater on Mercury. Whether Enheduana was the first author or the first character is a question the surviving evidence declines to answer. What can be said is that somewhere in the long transmission, the practice of binding old threads into new cloth produced something that had not existed before: the idea that a poem comes from a person and that the person can be named.